Okay, right. Hello and welcome back to another video. So this week we're going to be going through a quick presentation that I've put together for Beyond FX's apprenticeship program. So it's going to be a quick introduction to Unreal and the rendering pipeline, and then how we can sort of leverage that in our materials to do various visual effects. So real honor to be asked to be involved in this, and so hopefully we're going to get some really good learning out of it. And yeah, so let's get started. So here's our sort of title, real-time rendering and materials in Unreal. So having a look, very rough look at kind of like the pipeline and how that works, and then how we can leverage that in our materials to do various things. So a little bit about me, more for the presentation, but hopefully if you're watching this channel you sort of vaguely know who I am. My name's Tom. I've been doing this for about 12 years. That's my website, that's this YouTube channel, and here's some places that I've worked and some games that I've worked on, so we'll quickly gloss over all of that. Quick disclaimer, who doesn't love a disclaimer in a presentation? So Unreal 5 has just come out, literally last week as of recording, and it's going to change everything. Of course it is. But that's basically par for the course for the games industry. Things are changing all the time. Things are always getting new technologies, new pipelines, new hardware, new software, all of it. It's all changing all the time. So unfortunately, if you're going to work in this industry, you need to be aware of that and willing to kind of always keep up to date with the latest. So things like nanite, things like lumen, real-time path and ray tracing, all those are going to have an effect on the kind of things we're talking about today, but they're not going to be included in this because they're too new to have really kind of like made their mark, at least in my workflow. But that isn't to say that what we're doing here or what we're going to talk about here isn't also useful. Yes, Unreal 5 has just come out, it's amazing, but not everyone's going to be using it straight away. Lots of in-house studios are going to have not as well developed tech, and also different hardware and different sort of constraints exist in different projects. So I mentioned here mobile and VR. We're probably not going to be using nanite and lumen in VR anytime soon. We just don't have the hardware, the frame rates are too important. As I say here, it's been 20 years, if not longer, we're still using flipbook textures. We probably still will. There's some really nice real-time fluids happening now, but realistically what you do with your real-time fluid a lot of the time is bake it down to a flipbook texture and use a flipbook texture. So yes, there's new technology coming out all the time, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be using it. But yeah, that said, so what are we looking at? Well, the way 3D models are rendered to the screen by Unreal and by other sort of packages is kind of a two-step process. So the first thing that happens is all the models are loaded into memory, and it draws all the points, all the vertices at this point here. So effectively the first thing it does, builds this kind of massive network of points, and that's the vertex shader, and that's sort of the first step in this two-step process. And there's things we can do at this stage to affect our models, and we'll be having a look at that and how we can kind of leverage the vertex shader for optimization and performance reasons, as well as just sort of being available at that point. Once it has this massive network of points, it does what's called rasterization, and basically draws triangles and fills all the triangles in to make them sort of the models, the 3D models of the scene. And then finally it does the pixel shader, fills those triangles in with the shaders that we've written. One thing to note, says it here, the pixel shader is also known as the fragment shader. So I think technically until it's drawn on the screen, it's not a pixel, it's just a fragment. So the little bits of code that eventually will become a pixel will be fragments. And so you can have multiple fragments and you can combine things. If you think about translucency and overdraw, the final rendered pixel will have multiple fragments in it, so multiple different material snippets. But effectively they're just the same thing. So the pixel shader, fragment shader, it's just a terminology thing. Took me about 3-4 years of working in the industry before I realized that these were actually the same thing, and it wasn't a 3-step process. So I just want to highlight that here. So overall, two steps. First, draw all the points, then all the triangles. We can't really do anything about filling in the triangles, this rasterization. There's no way we can affect this, but we can affect things here with the vertex shader, and we can definitely affect things here with the pixel shader. So two things that we can do in our materials to affect this sort of pipeline. So vertex colors, let's start there. Vertex or vertices, numbers of vertices in a scene, generally way fewer. Again, this might be something that changes with Nanite in the future, but if we think about how many pixels are being rendered to a screen in an HD display, 1920 by 1080, that's 2 million pixels. Most 3D scenes, even with modern hardware, don't have 2 million vertices. So anything we can do on our vertex level is going to be cheaper. Big part of video game art, optimization and performance, we want to keep things cheap where we can. So to do that, we try and do things on our vertex, in our vertex shader where we can. And one of the most basic things we can do with vertex colors is paint masks. So I have here an example of just a simple light shaft plane, light coming in through a window. We'd probably want to put some light rays and textures and things on that to make it look nice. But we know that we never want to see the edges. We want to have these, the top, bottom, and sort of far edge. They never want to be visible. Well, we could use a texture. We could use UVs, and we'll cover those later. But if there's a part of our mesh that we never want to see, we don't want to spend a texture on it, we can paint that into the vertex colors. So it's a really simple way to get information and data into our model. The more complex the model, the more verts we have, fair enough, but we're always going to have way fewer vertices than we would pixels in our model. So it's a really cost-effective, really efficient way to do this. Doesn't just have to be masks. So this is obviously some kind of foliage, little plants here. The red channel is working as a stiffness. Where it's stuck in the ground, it never wants to move. That makes sense. Where it's sort of unconstrained at the tip, we've got this the red as full value, and we're getting that movement. Well, that's great. We can paint this kind of stiffness mask, but there's more we can do with this. If you look at the little leaves, you can see how there's sort of secondary motion on this. So in our green channel, I've called this secondary movement, we've painted a little second or additional color channel. So I've got a little bit of vertical bouncing up and down that is being controlled by that green channel. And then finally, we're using the blue channel as an offset. So a very common thing to do if you're using time and you want to animate your model, and we'll cover well positioned and animation in a bit. But if you're covering or you're animating your model, you tend not to want all of the leaves or all of the bits to be moving at the same time. And one way we can do that is by using the vertex colors to add kind of a time offset. So each one of these little leaves has a completely different value of blue. It's uniform across the whole leaf, but it means that these kind of animations now, once they're processed, they're not all together in time, and so we get kind of that breaking up. So a really nice way of kind of baking both a sort of mask, our sort of stiffness into our material or into our model, but also our sort of time animations as well. So lots we can do with our sort of vertex colors. I've highlighted a link to my website here where there's some scripts. Basic one just for randomizing vertex colors. So here's the first one at the top here. Load it into Python, and you can just run it, and it'll randomly generate a color for each of your vertex colors in your selection. Really worth investigating for sort of vertex color work. Sort of speeds things up. There's a new script going to go up soon, so check out for that in a future video. Cool. So I've been telling you vertex colors are cheap. Well, let's prove it. Well, here we have vertex lighting. Now this is a lit translucent square, very simple plane, just 4 vertices, and we've got 2 different options here. So it's lit translucency. It's a very expensive way to render things. You have to do all your lighting calculations, and then because it's translucent, it could potentially get drawn multiple times to the screen. It's quite an expensive way of shading things. So because of that, Unreal actually offers this intrinsic kind of lighting mode. So here on the left, we're using volumetric directional, and that's this one. And in this one, we're using volumetric per vertex directional. So this plane cube above is casting a shadow on these 2 planes. And in this one, the vertex here is black because it's in shade. The vertex here is white. And what we're getting is just a simple linear interpolation between the two vertices. So the values just sort of scale down over time, or over distance, I guess. In this case, this is per pixel lighting. The shadow is correct where it is. And we're getting a more accurate result, but we're paying for that cost in our shader, and we can get some statistics here as well. So slightly higher instruction counts on our base pass. So these two top ones are the per pixel cost, but a lower per vertex cost. But as we've already said, the number of vertices is much fewer. So this is a much cheaper way of doing lighting. So when we're thinking about lighting, if you are doing lit translucency, just think, can we do this per vertex? And Unreal offers you the option to do that. Cool. So what else can we do with our vertices? Well, we can use pure maths to drive an animation. Fantastic example of this in action. Video game came out a little while ago now called Abzu. Based underwater, obviously you're underwater, almost everything's moving all the time underwater, all the foliage, all the fish, little animations, even just like the flippers on the main character. All of these animations, too expensive to do with skeletal mesh. If every one of these fish was its own actor running an animation, that would be incredibly expensive. Maybe these days hardware could handle it, but 7 years ago, whatever it is, 6 years ago, definitely couldn't. And so using the vertex animation, basic math, basic sine waves, you can create these kind of swimming animations or plants moving, or even this the jellyfish, that sort of pulsating. It's all calculatable and being driven as an animation. So really nice way of doing this. And they've actually done a talk at GDC, so another link to that here, creating the art of Abzu. If we go in somewhere about here, I think, yeah, you can see those kind of like sine waves being applied to this fish mesh. And because it's only got a few, I don't know, 100 verts or 1,000, well, not 1,000, a few hundred verts, it's a very cheap way of doing this animation, and it's all just procedural. But it turns out in nature, most things kind of have this sort of similar patterns, and we can use this for simple animation for animals, things like this. We can use it for foliage, cloth. So the example I've got here is just a simple hanging piece of cloth with some sine waves running through it, and it's a very cheap, performant way of doing this. Anything that wobbles slightly, cables, all of that stuff, really, really powerful. Great way of sort of expanding our shaders to be have a little bit of movement and animation in them. Cool. So we can take that one step further. We can do a nice basic repeating animation such as this cloth and the fabric moving, no problem. But if we want something a bit more complex, well, we can use what's called a vertex animation texture. So this is using texture data to store animation and then playing it back through the vertex shader. And it's a very, very cheap way of doing this. So here we have this beetle. This is from the Epic content examples. Beetle, little thing, it's going to fit thousands of these on the screen potentially, driven by a particle system, however we want to do it. Again, if they were little animated meshes, skeletal mesh, very expensive to update bone animations compared to doing just a simple vertex shader. So this was the first example I saw of this many years ago, so again 2015, but being able to take a offline baked fluid simulation and then bring that into Unreal, very powerful technique, really quite impressive for the time. Still impressive now. We don't see this kind of fluid animation in games very often, partly because it's very hard to do, it's very expensive, but by baking that animation down to a texture, it becomes very simple, becomes very performant to read and run back. So what is it doing? Well, if you think about animation is just movement of a vertex over time. Well, movement or a kind of an offset for each vertex, well, an offset is in X, Y, and Z, and an animation or a texture is in R, red, green, and blue. So we're storing the X, Y, Z offsets as RGB values in our texture. And you can do this for offsets, you can do this for normals, you can do this for rotations. All the information that you want, you can just store in a texture. And so this one down here is the movement of the beetle's wings and head and things. And it's a very, very small texture. It's 15 by 27. So that means that there are presumably, so either one way or the other, there's either 15 verts being updated and 27 frames of animation, or the other way around, depending if it's read horizontally or vertically. I didn't actually check how many verts are in this model, but it's not many. But this is very, very small. It's a very small texture, and so because of that, it's very cheap to read through and update, and you can get these really quite complex and sort of advanced animations very cheaply by using this technique called vertex animation. If you want to know more about it, there is a series by Side Effects on how to use Houdini to generate these. They are baked from one of your modeling packages. Epic produce a script that uses 3ds Max, and that's what you'll find in their documentation. And Houdini have done their own implementation as well. So there's various types of animation, and you can see just things like this, blending together 3 streams of fluid wouldn't even be possible with simple bone animation. It'd be very difficult to make a skeletal mesh to do that, but vertex animations can bake that down quite nicely. And there's an example here again of another texture, much more complicated. Our beetle was very, very optimized, 15 by 27, but even here, if it's number of vertices across by number of frames of animation down, and you can see it kind of updating here. So first row, second row, third row, and then there's something in the model that reads that data, presumably, or very often, a second UV set, and we'll talk about using multiple UV sets in a bit. And there we go. As it moves down, the model moves. Obviously, you can go back and watch these in your own time. I'll put a link to all the links from the slideshow in the YouTube description, so you can just go and check those as well. But really, really nice sort of fidelity to the animation. Really hard to do this with any kind of sort of well-positioned offset shader that isn't using vertex animation textures. And again, some more examples here of things being knocked apart and broken up and stuff. So very powerful technique. Cool. Another sort of advanced technique using well-positioned offsets. We can paint local pivots into our object and bake that in either in vertex colors or in additional UV channels. And we'll have a look at sort of how that works as well. So this is an example from Epic. Again, it's a Max script. If we think about something like a tree, where this is very, very useful, this top branch here, it's going to be connected and pivoting around the top of the tree trunk, because that's where the sort of the connection is happening. But our object's pivot is going to be down here, where the whole tree is placed. And then if we think about a leaf, the leaf is going to be rotating around this point as part of that branch, but it's also going to have its own local rotation around where the sort of the stem or the last bit of twig or whatever you want to call it connects back again. And what the pivot painter script does is it takes those local pivots and just bakes it into the model so they can be read back. And you can get some really nice complex movement and motion. It's all one model, it's all one shader, but because it's reading pivots locally from inside the model, there's lots of really powerful things you can do with that. You can see here, the whole tree would be rotating around the base, but each of these little branches leaves would be rotating around this point, and so it needs to be kind of baked into it. Very easy to set up in the material. Little bit of pre-processing required to kind of get that information. And there's some fun VFX things we can do with it as well. If we scroll down to the other examples, for example, this growing animation, it's one model, it's one mesh, it's one material, it's all being done via the vertex shader, but each one of the sort of hierarchy, each part is only growing from the next bit, and so we need to store these local pivots. So a really powerful technique to do this, and again, very optimal because we're doing it in vertex shader and storing it in very small textures. Another one, little building animation. This could very easily be done using sort of bone animation, but by doing it through here in the vertex shader, it's very cheap. And you could definitely see how this could be used on sort of a mobile game, something like that, where resources are very constrained, to build up little building animations and that kind of thing. So again, one model, one material, but a full set of animation, because all the pivots and things are baked into the model. Very nice, very powerful technique. Yes, sometimes storing things in vertex colors, you could also store things in additional UV channels. Both ways of just storing data. We use them for sort of painting colors or reading textures, but they can also be extended to these more sort of advanced techniques as well. And then finally, sticking with the vertex kind of shader, we can actually offset any calculations we want onto the vertex shader. So if we were doing a custom lighting, let's say some sort of stylized cell shaded game, maybe we don't want to do our lighting using the lighting engine. We'll kind of build our own lighting shading model. We could then push that onto the vertex and do it per vertex, and we could kind of like make it more optimal by doing it that way. Now, there's actually a little hidden feature of the vertex interpolator, as well as offsetting the rendering costs to be per vertex instead of per pixel. It can also read information from instances. So maybe not the best example, but here on the left, we've got 4 planes. These 2 on the left are the object position is just being plugged straight through the debug and into the emissive color, and you can see that each of these has its own unique object position, slightly different positions in X, Y, and Z. But these 2 here that are both selected, these have been painted with the foliage painter. And when you paint with the foliage painter, they all become instanced together, and the actor only has one position. And that's why these 2 planes have the same value on them, and you can see there's no difference there. So we wanted to try and use our object position to randomize things, and we'll talk about that later. We need to get the information per instance, and one way we can do this is by putting it through the vertex interpolator. And so what happens now is it reads the object's pivot point, puts that into the vertices, and that gets passed to the shader, and then these 2 are still just painted with foliage, but rather than being the same position and the same object position, it's reading the per instance position, not the per object position, or per actor position, I guess. So a little kind of, I don't know, hack, I suppose, where we're using the vertex interpolator not just for performance, but also to access something that wouldn't normally be available. Cool. Couple of examples there at the end, the pivot painter and vertex animations. If you have a look in the content examples, this is a great project. They've literally just updated it to Unreal 5. So if you go to the launcher, go to samples and go to content examples, there's loads of really good examples in there that you can break down in your own time and check out the annotations on. Great way to learn. I learnt loads from it, so highly recommend going in and checking those things out. Cool. So moving on through our rendering pipelines, and we've had a look at the vertex shader, all the different things we can do with our vertex shader, painting masks into it to be optimal and not spend resources on texture lookups, doing well position offset, moving vertices around, again optimally because there's not very many verts in there, and then some more advanced things, so pivot painting, or what was the other one? Vertex animations, so using textures and vertex animation together to kind of like really extend that workflow. So after our triangles are drawn, they've been rasterized, moving down through that pipeline, they get UVs. Now, UVs are a way of assigning a texture to a triangle, and you'll hopefully all recognize UV layouts. And so this object here, this mesh, is using some tiling materials. We've got overlapping UVs, and it's a way of looking up where in the texture should be applied to that part of the model. But they're more than that. They can be used in lots of different ways. And so, yeah, more than just a way of aligning or assigning textures. They can be used directly as textures. So let's stop for a minute and go back. Let's think about exactly what UVs are. Well, it's just a grid of numbers. It's just a grid of data. And so if it's a 256 texture that's been applied, effectively we have 256 grid cells where we've got 0, 0 in the top left. That's an Unreal convention. It's not always true in 3D rendering, but there's always a 0, 0. And then 1, 1 is in the other end or the other corner. So in this case, the bottom right. So here we can see we've got the linear gradient node, and that's a function that comes with Unreal. And all it's doing is taking the red channel of the UV, and that gives us a gradient. So effectively we get a grid of unique indices, so 0, 0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, etc. And then coming down the other way, 0.1, 0, 0.11, etc, etc, etc. So we have a unique grid of two-dimensional points, and that's how the mesh triangle looks up where the UV is and then looks up where the texture is. Quick note about notation. UVs are called UVs because effectively they're actually UVW, and so it's a coordinate system. So X, Y, and Z, usually used for the local or world space, whatever coordinate system defines points in space. UVW, because you can get volumetric textures, it's just the 3 letters that come before X, Y, Z. So it's just a kind of notation thing. Often we don't refer to W, especially in games. We don't really use volumetric textures very often. We'll get to some later actually, but yeah, the UV doesn't stand for anything clever. It's just literally the two of the 3 letters that are the 3 letters that come before X, Y, Z in the alphabet. And they're interchangeable. So here, if we're masking out the red channel of a text coordinate, this is a UV, sort of UV data. This is a mask. It's not isolating the red channel, it's isolating the U channel. And so XYZ, UVW, RGB, they're pretty interchangeable when we're dealing with shaders. The engine doesn't care what the terminology is we use to describe it. So you will see these things quite often. Another thing that Unreal have recently done, or not that recently, but if you're ever looking at and debugging your shaders, they've decided that all floats need to be rendered as if it's a vector and the float value is in the red channel. So here, this has only actually got one kind of item of data. In this case, it's just the U gradient of this text code, and it's displaying it as a red channel. So it's displaying the single value as if it was a vector, which I don't think is that helpful, but maybe is a reason under the hood that I don't understand. It didn't used to do this. That used to be a grayscale value, which I think would make more sense. But there we are. It is what it is. That's what it does now, is it takes that kind of float value here and renders it as a vector, assuming that's in the red channel. Cool. So yes, gradients. So yeah, we can use our UVs directly. We don't actually have to use textures. If you go back to our light shaft example right at the beginning, you might want a gradient that goes all the way down our light shaft. That can just be a gradient. We can take that from the UVs of the model if it's been aligned correctly. Let's say we wanted a circular fall off. Well, we can do that using UVs. And the advantage of these sort of mathematically defined kind of patterns is exactly that. They're mathematically defined. They're not using any texture lookups to do that. And so it's a very cheap way of creating gradients across a model that don't use any texture information. That said, don't be stingy. Very common to see little sparks and little kind of embers that are just using a little circular mathematically derived shape. Even the smallest spark has a little bit of sort of detail to it. It has a hot spot at the front or a little kind of cross point or something. So if you're using parts of your shader where you need gradients or circular fall-offs, that's fine, but I wouldn't use it as the whole shader unless that's very specifically the look you're going for. And we can build up really complex things with this. So there's an example here from Twitter recently. This radial kind of menu, everything fully parametric, but all mathematically based. rather than using any textures. Really cheap and powerful way to do this. And we can see just using pure math. And in this case, we're using a UI element. It kind of makes sense that it's crisp and clean and doesn't need any texture information. So something to think about. How can you eliminate textures? What can you build up from your sort of pure math gradients? And there's a lot you can do, and we'll cover that in a bit more later as well. So this is much more than just these three you can push if you really want to. Okay, so animating UVs, moving textures around, absolute bread and butter of VFX work. All we're doing is we're taking our UVs and we're adding time and we're getting movement. That's it. We're not actually animating the texture, we're animating the UV lookup of the texture, and that creates this sort of illusion of movement. Here we're doing it just directly with time. In this case I'm using a panner node, but as you can see the output's exactly the same. So the panner has values of 1 in X and Y, and that's why it's scrolling up towards the top left, because we're adding values in our UVs. So our UVs are going to the bottom right. And a bit like how if you're on a train and the train next to you starts moving, it looks like you're moving, or you feel like you're moving. It's the same thing here. The texture isn't moving, but the UVs are. So the UVs are moving off to the bottom right. So therefore the texture looks like it's moving up to the top left. Doesn't really matter. We can just plug in numbers until we get the animation that we want. But that's exactly, or technically, what's happening under the hood here. And the same with rotation. Slightly more complicated maths to do rotation than just adding, but same principle. It's taking time and kind of affecting the UVs over time. And then finally, scaling. If we scale our UVs, we make our tiling bigger, our tiling smaller. And I'm just using a frac here to kind of create that repeat in that, so it doesn't scale up to infinite and tiny and things. Absolute bread and butter of VFX work in games. Even with all the sort of crazy modern hardware and technology, most things that we break down come into scrolling textures. So fire, water, smoke, anything like that can all be done with sort of scrolling textures. And the secret, not to spoil it for anyone, is by taking two different textures, or in this case the same texture twice, and multiplying them against each other, moving in different ways. So the complexity of what's happening here in this final node is really quite high. Every pixel's changing quite a lot and dynamically per frame, and we're getting really sort of the illusion of really complex motion here, but actually all it is two static textures multiplied against each other and moving in different directions. One thing to note, a little kind of feature that I always include in this, it's always a good idea to scale one of your textures slightly. If you didn't do that, as they were moving, occasionally they would come and line on top of each other perfectly, and you'd get a little pause frame as it wasn't looking like it was moving. And it's a really simple one node. Just multiply one of your two textures by a little bit, and then that'll scale up. And now you've got two textures of very similar looking. I mean, they're the same thing twice, but ever so slightly different in scale, and therefore you get a two textures that never can completely line on top of each other. Yeah, really easy to miss step, but I've definitely seen materials where everything's moving nicely and then suddenly it kind of pauses, and that's what's happened there. The two materials, or the two textures scrolling, have lined up on top of each other perfectly, and it's a very simple little fix to get out of that. Cool. So what else can we do with UVs? We can build up textures and do that. Or build up shapes mathematically. We can animate them. We can also do this thing called gradient mapping. Now this is a really powerful technique. So in this case we have a fire gradient. So I've got black on one end, white at the other, and then various reds and yellows in the middle to kind of define the colours of a fire. You might think of it as like a temperature curve, or this kind of, I'd call it a fire gradient. Well, what we can do is we can plug a black and white image, in this case just some renders of a fire simulation, and if we plug that into our UVs of our gradient, these two are the same, it will colorize our image based on the sort of the grayscale values. So if we go back to our UVs, think about what they are in terms of the two gradients. Down here, 1, 1, up here, 0, 0. Well, we're only going to effectively be using a single channel of this, but effectively we get a diagonal straight line through that gradient. And so where we plug in black, we're still going to get black. When we plug in white, we're still going to get white. But if we plug in this 0.25 grey or 0.8 grey or whatever, we're going to get those reds and yellows. And so we're going to get a kind of a sample through the diagonal of that colour gradient. And because our gradient is set up like this, we can have black at the top, white at the bottom. And so the grayscale values get mapped to the colours of the gradient. Hopefully that makes sense. It's incredibly powerful. You can do really optimal things with this. If you've got fire in your game, but you've got different levels, or you've got different magics, maybe you've got kind of green fell flame, kind of World of Warcraft style, or purple undead flame, that kind of stuff. You don't want to re-render your simulations with lots of different colors on them. It's going to be very expensive. Instead, we can sample a black and white texture and the gradient. And there's some huge advantages to this. So the gradient itself doesn't need to be very, very big. And so you can store lots and lots of gradients very cheaply. And because we're using a black and white texture, we can actually use a slightly higher compression ratio. And so you can kind of up the quality of your texture. And so the overall result is better quality, more flexible, more usable, and less memory, which is great. One example of this, this is from Halo 1. Again, getting a bit old now, but it's always good to look back at the old games to see how they did it, because they had to do it optimally to see how we can do things optimally now. But they only had a single texture for every muzzle flash in the game. It's a bit small to see maybe, but here we've got the shotgun, cloudy kind of noise texture. You can see it better here with some detail. If we apply that gradient underneath, very similar to our fire gradient up here, what we'll get is black where it's black, white where it's hottest, reds and yellows. Looks like a sort of fiery explosion from a shotgun. Works really well. If we apply this blue to sort of yellowy orangey greens, we get the carbine muzzle flash in there. Spike rifle, again, slightly different color gradient. And then finally the really cool one, the plasma rifle. Well, here we don't just go from dark to light and colorize. We go dark, light, and you can see we get this kind of haloing effect, excuse the pun, but we get this kind of additional inner layer, which looks kind of cool and plasma-y. But again, it's just a very simple gradient texture, one clouds noise texture, and being applied via the UVs. So this texture would be plugged into the UVs of this gradient, and that would do the sort of the gradient mapping for you. Moving on, more complex things we can do with UVs. So this is UV distortion. So I have a really obvious grid texture, and I'm just taking, again, simple noise, and I'm adding it to the UVs before I sample my texture. And this is a very powerful thing to do. Great for fluids. You can see this almost looks like we're looking at the texture through water. Great for fire. Fantastic talk here by Simon Trumpler. Breaking up, or breaking down, I should say, the textures and the materials that they made for rhyme. So taking the UVs, adding some noise, adding some more noise, using a mask to create shape, and then a gradient, which again would probably be done through UVs, just to mask out the result as well. And what you get is this very cool stylized fire, all procedurally built up through those textures. Well worth checking out this talk. There's loads of other interesting kind of techie VFX things in here, but for UV distortion you can get this very nice stylized fire, and again very cheap, not using particularly big textures, not a very complex shader, just adding a little bit of noise to our UVs before we sample our texture. Two things to note in this. One, I've offset my noise so that I'm not adding any overall data or any overall values to our UVs. All the values in the original UV go from 0 to 1. If I only added values, you'd end up being offset, which maybe is fine, but in this case I want to keep things centered. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking the range of my noise texture and just centering it around 0. So by subtracting a half, we're now adding as much as we are taking away, which keeps things centered. Another thing to note is the intensity is very low. The values here go from 0 to 1. A little bit goes a long way with UV distortion, so you're looking at maybe adding, in this case, 5%, and there's quite a bit of movement happening here already, so even sort of 2%, 3% would be subtle enough, but pretty visible in there, so subtlety, a little bit goes a long way. Cool. We can take this one step further. We can have something called a flow map. So here we're just doing a UV distortion that just kind of scrolls through and moves through the texture space and creates distortion. Well, what happens if we want things that move around objects and this kind of thing? Well, again, this is going back a long time ago, 2010, back when I joined the games industry. And effectively what we're doing is we're painting the motion, or painting the movement vectors of the water around the object. So here we've got a kind of dragon and some pillars in the water. Well, if we look at this texture, it's been hand painted, I believe, but the movement of the water around these pillars, and you can see that kind of on the texture there. And if I just play the video, it's not the best quality to see, but you can see how the movement or the water is kind of flowing around our object. So by taking a baked texture for where the flow is going, we can kind of have that and have the water move around. And there's a couple of things going on. So one, if we're just adding to our movement all the time, eventually we get a lot of distortion. And I said it's quite subtle, the distortion and UV distortion. So the more you add, the more distorted things are going to be. And so what we do is we have this sort of double sine wave. So we have one version of the material moving forwards and getting distorted, and then we have another version offset in time, and then we just blend between them. And so effectively this one's getting more and more distorted, and then this one starts getting distorted, and we just blend and blend and blend and blend. And so we're going back and forth, so we never see the big amount of distortion or the pop as it resets back to no distortion. And that's kind of the technique of flow maps. So Unreal has a node for this. It's called the flow map node. Unsurprisingly, it's just a function. You can double click it, open it up, have a look at the math inside, or it's a great breakdown by Ben Cloward on Unreal on YouTube. So taking sort of water and building it up, painting some flow maps, some really interesting things in here, and again ending up with basically the same result as the flow map node, I believe, but doing it sort of from the first principles of maths, which is always the best way to do it. Learn how these things are done, and we'll get a result where it's kind of flowing around. You can see it kind of flowing in and flowing out. Pretty cool. One thing we can do with this, take it one step further, I've had quite a lot of success using vertex painted flow map. So again, going back to rendering and performance costs, reading a texture it's quite expensive, reading vertex colors is quite cheap. It's also very dynamic. It's allowed us to go in and just sort of paint our flow map in the engine. It's not as high fidelity, for sure. It's a bit fiddly sometimes. You have to spend a little bit of time just sort of painting your flow maps, but it works really well, and it's just using those vertex colors. So reading in where the red channel, things will flow left, and then green channel, things will flow up and down, and you can kind of build up the flow map in engine that way. Quite an efficient way to do it because it's all done on the vertices, but you get a nice result. Cool. Taking that one step further, we can have what are called motion vectors. So again, basically this is a flipbook. This is Clement Lazard's website. 8x8 baked flipbook. So a simulation, just taking 64 renders, putting them into a flipbook, playing them back one after another, creating a nice animation, but because it's so big, you end up with a lot of stuttering and jumping, especially here towards the end between those frames. Well, what can we do to fix that? Well, we can add motion vectors, and what it's doing, if we have a look here on the sort of blended side. It's taking the position of the pixel in this frame and the position where it needs to be in the next frame, and it's just moving it linearly and creating that movement. So effectively it's kind of like a flow map per frame to blend our other frames together. And if you have a look at the movement, it's not perfect. There's a little bit of kind of sort of staccato-ness to it, especially up here where the smoke's moving a lot. It doesn't seamlessly blend from one to the other, but it's a lot better. It's a very good kind of technique for adding detail for these big sort of slow moving flipbooks. So we go down and have a look. Each one here, as I say, anytime you see anything sort of red and green colors, think about UVs. UVs are red and use red, and V is green. So anytime you see these kind of colors, you can sort of assume that there's something, or there's possibly something happening with the UVs. And yeah, so it's a 64 frame flipbook, and then here's the 64 frame motion vector to calculate going from one frame to the next. Really nice breakdown here as well. Cool. Taking a sort of sidestep now, going back to kind of what UVs are and how they work. There's nothing stopping us having multiple UV sets. We already do a lot of the time. If we're dealing with baked lighting, you have your sort of diffuse UV layout where you want to paint your textures, then you have a second UV layout for your lighting, but there's nothing stopping us creating VFX UV layouts as well. Got an example here. If you've got a character running around, obviously the layout for the clothes and the skin and everything is going to be painted in one UV, but if I want to have a dynamic shader on the character so that when they walk into water they get wet, if their UVs are laid out in such a way that it's just a sort of a planar map from the front, it's really easy to write that shader because it's just a gradient that moves up and down based on the height that you got submerged by. If all your sort of clothes are laid out all over the place, it's really hard to do that. And so having an extra UV set in terms of the kind of costs, it's not zero cost, it's not free, but it's a pretty low cost versus the sort of ease of use of then being able to then just kind of scroll a mask up to create sort of wetness in the sort of bottom of your trousers or whatever you're doing. And we can take that one step further. There's other ways we can do that. So here, a bit of an old school technique now. Maybe would be better ways to do this using world position as we looked at earlier. But we have a simple little moth here flapping. Every one of the different potential frames of the animation has been modeled. So the wing, as it goes up, as it goes down, gives us huge amounts of control because we can just model whatever we like, and then we're using our shader to play those back one frame at a time. Something like this moth, I say maybe there's better ways to do that using the sine wave vertex animations we looked at earlier, but if we get back to Clement's website again, stylized lightning, or even just sort of realistic lightning. If you've ever got these kinds of things here, each one of the frames of this lightning would have been modeled. It gives us full control, and all we're doing then again is playing back those animations or those frames one after another. Very powerful way of creating cool effects. A very controllable way, which is really nice. You can do this with beams and noise, and you can do it procedurally, but just modeling out the frames, modeling out the shapes of the lightning, and then playing them back. A really nice way of doing that. Cool. Okay. A few more sort of material techniques we can use as part of our kind of like rendering. We can get information out of our models and bring them into our shader. So for example here, I'm taking my object position, I'm running it through the vertex interpolator, say that this is compatible with foliage, and I'm just doing some math. I'm just breaking this up, trying to hide the fact that I'm reading that data. And so I'm using the frac, which gives me a repeating value, and then I'm also using a sine wave just to sort of obfuscate that. So if I place an object in the world, I don't know what value I'm going to get, and we end up with a shader like this. So this is just being previewed on 6 cubes, and each one you can see has a different grayscale value based on where it is in the world. So as you're moving them around, it randomizes things for you. Really useful for just kind of using a shader based technique to break up and bring randomness into our materials. based on the object position. So yeah, just one of quite a few different ways we can get information out of our model. Object position, object rotation, and scale, those can all be passed through, and there's others as well. So ways of getting model information into the shader. Another example I have here, using the world position. So this is what I would call a projected texture. I haven't actually textured it, I've just done the UVs, but you can see again that sort of red, green and yellow color arrangement. If it looks like UVs, I mean, you can just use them as UVs. And so I'm taking the world position of the pixel, masking out the red and green, so ignoring any Z height, so we get a top-down projection, and dividing by a value. Now in this case it's 256 world units. And so if we textured this, if we plugged this into a text chord, this would work as UVs and we would get a projected texture. Really useful for terrain, anything top down, especially when you've got models that you're blending into the terrain. There's a whole sort of suite of techniques you can do to do that, but just a top down projection, really nice for sort of building up terrains on top of models on top of terrains. Similarly with water, things like that, anything that's going to be flat, good idea or good candidate for top down projection. And water works really well. So if you project your waves, so if you've got kind of like world position offset waves in world space, if you project them, you can have objects that are floating by using the same information. And so a little cube that floats on the water, by having the same information, that all works. If you want to know more about this kind of thing, a really good talk from GDC, again a few years ago now, to update all my references, but the techniques are still there, it still works really well. This was from building the game Abduction. Lots of
have easy access separately
tips and tricks they do
through this with
building
2-height
up,
map, specific mesh itself, things like
building up the game using Unreal, sort of leveraging the power of Unreal's material system to do some really nice things. So yeah, world aligned textures and projections and combining things together, so well worth checking out. Okay, last couple of things. So we're way back in the rendering pipeline. We've done our vertex shading and world position and masks. We've done our UVs, so maybe UV distortion or flow maps, or even just panning textures, whatever it is. And then finally, we're sort of rendering them to the screen. And Unreal does this in passes. So it does multiple different kind of render passes depending on what information we're interested in, and it composites all together real time into the final image. So you can see up here our normals. We've got sort of translucency, things like that. But one thing that's really, really useful that we use all the time is depth. And so this is our, what I would call a depth buffer, and it basically every pixel is just encoding the distance from the camera. We're getting this banding in the sky dome. That's to do with precision because the sky dome is so far away. But we can see here in our kind of like foreground, this table and chairs, the closest point's going to be these dark points here, maybe the table light, and then as you get further away into the scene, the values are going up. And this is really powerful. It allows us to do things like depth fade. So we can compare the pixel being rendered in our material to the depth of the scene, and we can work out where we get intersections between sort of translucent objects. Very, very useful, very powerful, and all this information is usable in our post processes. And so we can build up post-process materials, such as the one here in Breath of the Wild. I don't quite know why, but if you go to this part of this castle, this corner here where it's broken out, the post-process doesn't apply. And so you can get a kind of a look at what the models look like before they have the post-process applied, which is kind of cool. Obviously we have this sort of cartoony stylized shader here with the sort of two-tone, but actually the models, if you look at them, are these kind of soft, round, plasticky, toy-like figures. This is the shader, and it's the post-processing that's applying that on afterwards. So after we've done all our rendering, vertex shader, pixel shader, we can also do post-processing and apply that to our renders to our scene before they get rendered. Very cool. Couple more things. One thing I really want to kind of call out as a really powerful tool in the sort of shader arsenal is the dot product. This is a mathematical operator like adding, subtracting, dividing, but it compares two vectors. And so in this case, we're comparing 0, 0, 1, which is the world up. So we're saying, does our pixel being rendered face the sky? Does it face up? And I'm using here the pixel normal. So again, this is input data, taking information from the model and taking it into the shader. And right back to that first example, or that first sort of conversation about pixel versus vertex, it's more expensive to do this dot product on the pixel normal because it's doing it per pixel. If we're doing it with the vertex normal, we do per vertex, but we wouldn't get the normal maps input if we were doing it on the vertex normal. So it's a really good way of doing kind of location-based things in our shaders, or facing ratio things in our shaders. So in this case, you could do snow on top of rocks. Very common. You've got a 3D rock, you want to put it in the scene and rotate it around. You want to not be constrained about where you can rotate this when you're building your environment. And so if you do your shader as a top-down projection, you can get more reuse out of your object. Similarly, when we do lighting, so when the engine does lighting, it uses the dot product to compare the surface of the object to the light direction. And so if we're doing effects that look a bit like lighting, we can do that using the dot product here, which is a really nice way to do that. Link here to a video I did a while back, just talking about dot product and going more in depth into things, into the, sort of the maths behind it. So it's something that doesn't come up very often in sort of high school math, but is incredibly useful in sort of graphics maths, which is obviously what we're doing here, building our shaders. So well worth checking out and familiarizing yourself with. Very, very useful for doing all sorts of cool effects. And then last one, or last couple, cube maps. So this is a way of representing an environment, or a way of representing a sort of, a 3D space into a 2D texture. So reflections, real-time reflections, bit of a holy grail, so expensive to do. Starting to get there. Now we get real-time path tracing, but again, not necessarily going to be on every platform. And so a lot of the time it's just cheaper to fake it. It's what we've been doing for years. It works, and you can get much more sort of optimal results. So here I've got a captured cube map, and what that means is effectively it takes 6 renders, front, back, left, right, up and down, combines it into one texture, and then you can read that back and you get this kind of illusion of a very shiny sphere, where it's not actually a shiny sphere, it's a captured environment replayed on an object. And it's the basis of these Spider-Man windows. So Assassin's Creed did it first, but Spider-Man maybe popularized it. If we look inside the model, inside these buildings, you can see the illusion of an interior, but it's not really an interior, it's a captured cube map. It would be too expensive to render those insides, and so what we get instead is a fake, is an illusion. So a lot of what we do in VFX is a fake, and so, at least in game VFX, and so you get this illusion of an interior because you can't actually go inside there. And it does break down occasionally. If you look at the edge of the buildings, occasionally there's a door going out to nothing, and you can see as you go around that corner, it's not the same window in the same building there. So it is a fake, but a very convincing one, especially as you're kind of flying past and not right up close here in this video. So again, another little kind of technique to have in your arsenal. If you're going to do things like lighting or reflections or environments, much cheaper to fake it. You can't really have hundreds of particles all doing real-time reflections. It's just not feasible. So the last thing, we're going to have a quick look at some cool stuff using our gameplay to do things, or our engine to actually write things back to shaders, or write things back to textures. So this is render targets. Fine. And so, for example, if you were walking your character around in the snow, you'd want to have a trail where you've kind of moved and left things behind. Well, how do we do that? Well, we take our character, and in this case they actually do it from the bottom up because it makes more sense for snow, and as you move around, there we go, can find the example. As you move around, it writes to a texture and then samples that back in the other material. So as you're moving around, the character's writing data to a texture, and a different shader is reading that data, and so we're passing information through a shader or through a texture to create this kind of effect. Very cool, works very well. And then you can do things like fade it out over time and all that kind of stuff. So very powerful technique for affecting the world around us through our shaders and our renderers. Moving forwards, this is very, very recent, just 22, so January this year. But it's using those same kind of techniques. So if we have a look here, just here where it's a vertical sort of or near vertical space or shape, there's some projection issues. So this is a top-down projected simulation where it's taking the fluid simulation that's being solved, writing it to texture, and then using that with the height map to do this very convincing, very kind of realistic fluid simulation. But if you look here, you can see there's a projection issue. And so you can kind of see the techniques that are happening underneath. Now, not criticizing, this is very, very impressive, doing things with caustics that are based on depth and all this, but effectively all that's happening here is some very complicated shaders as it's kind of doing this fluid simulation. So reading and writing two textures, the physics object there, the boat, kind of sampling the same texture to get some motion. So a very, very impressive result, but using those same kind of things of writing texture. So the same ideas and principles as the snow, but using fluid dynamics now rather than just a character moving around. Taking that one step further, this is from a while back. This was some sort of R&D that Epic were doing. Again, taking a 2D simulation and storing all the steps of that 2D set or simulation as textures and then reading it back. So you're using your textures to store data as part of your solver. And you'll see here in this example, as he moves this cursor around, it's moving the fluid, blending these shapes together and these colors together very impressively and very quickly. That was a while back, and then literally a few days ago, with Unreal 5 coming out, there is now a Niagara Fluids plugin. I don't think it's standard as yet. I think you have to go and enable it as a separate thing, but all those things we were just looking at, this is now being done real time in Niagara, and it's taking all of the data, I believe, it's taking all the data that's required in those simulations, so the density, the velocity, the movement, the heat, all of that, and baking it to textures. So you're taking that 3D kind of volume voxelized information and baking it to texture, and because it's using a texture, it's very quick on the GPU to look these things up, so the hardware has caught up. Is it still a shader if it's a 3D volume that gets rendered as velocity? Yeah, I don't see why not, and you can see we get some very impressive results happening here for sort of real-time fluids. So very exciting times for the future of game art VFX for sure. Very cool. There we are, Niagara Fluids, and then the final thing, shaders. Amazing. Great website here called Shader Toy. So this is a kind of community of people writing shaders that do fun, cool things, not necessarily for game art, but for just sort of learning and enjoyment. So we have here sort of Facebook scrolling shader, but it's all derived, it's all mathematically driven, and so I don't believe they're using any textures in this one. Doesn't look like it. This is, of course, I believe, well, I say of course, this is GSL, I think, rather than HLSL. There's two different shading languages. Obviously in Unreal we do things node-based, and we have kind of connections to that. But effectively all we're doing is programming shader language, and so there's GSL and HLSL, which are very similar in terms of features, and you can get some nice results. Looking at a user called IQ, who I believe wrote the website in the first place, these are environments, so these ones here especially, they're not modeled environments, they are purely mathematically shader driven, and if we go to the last link here, there's the man himself. This final scene will be created purely with mathematics and not any shader or texture input or model input. So defining the shape of a sphere, defining more spheres, adjusting the shapes, combining them, maximums and minimums. You can build up the shape of the girl's face and then do your lighting calculations. Again, the dot product type calculations we were talking about before, adding more details, and again it's all just mathematical. You can go and open this and dig into it and find the breakdown and dig into this. Maybe a texture being applied there. Noises are expensive to generate computationally, because again it's a per pixel kind of thing, much easier to use a texture. So as a optimization, using one texture for noise, but I think you'll agree that's quite impressive considering it's just one texture, and even that's just an optimization. You could procedurally generate noise as well. So building up the hair, working out how to sort of plait and braid the hair together, very cool. And even the animation, you can see the head is moving. All of that is just mathematically driven, so a bit like the world position offset fish shader we looked at earlier, and then building up an environment and landscape, creating a mathematical curve, and defining the trees and all sorts. So, and then we are our sort of final rendered image. So nothing here, models, nothing textured, except that little noise. But all of the model, all of the environment, all of the texturing, all the lighting, just being driven by the maths of the shader code. So an awful lot we can do with these things. So cool. We will leave it there. Bit of a whistle-stop tour through the rendering pipeline and through the various parts. So starting out with the vertex shader, what can we do with that? Well, masks, optimizations, painting data into our model, kind of offsetting animations, all that kind of stuff on the vertex side of it. Then when we get to pixels, yes, we can just multiply two scrolling textures together, but we can also do things like UV distortion. Let's go back and just go through all these again quickly. We can do things like gradient mapping, we can do things like UV distortion, taking that little step further. Complex things like flow maps and motion vectors, and then finally kind of taking information back out of our renders, back out of our scene and environment. So things like the surface normal of our objects, world position, screen depth, that kind of thing. All ways we can then get information back into our shader and build up some cool VFX things. So cool. If you have any questions about any of that or anything else, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. Thank you for Beyond Effects for kind of, I guess, sponsoring this content, for asking me to put this together for their students. And hopefully it's been a kind of an interesting and informative talk. As I say, I'll put all these links into the comments below, so you can go and check those things out. But there we are. Until next time, enjoy making your shaders and yeah, building some cool things. And I'll see you all next time.